Where did the kids go? What happened to their 5 souls? Where did the kids go? I'm bounty hunting, got to bring those kids' souls back home. My soul is yellow, my trigger finger's lightning fast. Where did the kids go? Feel homicidal, cause baby I was born to blast. Where did that kid go? Martlet asked herself real low. Where did that kid go? Lost, bruised and battered, should not have gotten on the boat. Where did that kid go? Soroba asked to star low. My soul is yellow. Is his soul pure? Does he view any monster as